10 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my parents invited my fiancé and me to an exclusive steakhouse. It was not a celebration. They came to destroy my wedding. My father slammed a crumpled document onto our table and told my fiancé to ask me about the son I had coldly abandoned. My mother wiped away fake tears, warning him that I was ruined goods. They expected my fiancé to walk out in disgust. Instead, he reached into his briefcase, pulled out a Supreme Court-sealed file, and smiled. He told them he knew all about the boy because he was the one who helped me legally adopt him after my family threw me into the freezing streets. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to bury your truth. My name is Zuri. I am 29 years old and I run one of the largest private wealth management funds on the East Coast. Sitting beside me at the best table in Atlanta's most expensive steakhouse was Marcus, my 32-year-old fiancé. Marcus is a venture capitalist, a man who analyzes risk for a living and never loses his composure. We were supposed to be discussing the final details for our upcoming wedding. Instead, the air at the table was thick with hostility. Across from us sat my parents, Bishop Calvin and First Lady Vivian. They lead one of the largest megachurches in Georgia. To their congregation, they are the epitome of grace and spiritual guidance. To me, they are the architects of my darkest nightmares. The restaurant hummed with the quiet chatter of Atlanta's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the white linen tablecloths. Waiters in crisp suits moved silently between tables, pouring vintage wine and serving prime cuts of beef. It was the kind of place where corporate deals were made and high society reputations were cemented. My parents fit right in, projecting their carefully crafted image of wealthy success. Next to them sat my older sister Iman, the undisputed golden child of the Washington family. Iman is a prominent pediatrician, a leading member of a prestigious national sorority, and the flawless daughter my parents constantly paraded in public. Beside her was her husband Bradley. He comes from old generational wealth, a white family with deep corporate roots and a quiet underlying arrogance. Bradley always looked at me as if I were a stain on his perfect life, a lowly outcast who somehow managed to secure a seat at their magnificent table. We had barely ordered our drinks when the facade dropped. There was no warm greeting, no asking how the wedding preparations were going, and certainly no congratulations. My father, Bishop Calvin, leaned forward abruptly. The heavy gold watch on his wrist clinked against the pristine glass of his water goblet. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes narrowing with a calculated intensity. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With a swift, aggressive motion, he threw it across the table. It landed right on top of my silver charger plate, the sharp sound cutting through the gentle jazz music playing in the background. Ask her. Marcus? My father commanded, his voice carrying the deep, booming resonance he usually reserved for his Sunday sermons. Ask the woman you are about to marry why she never talks about the child she threw away. I did not flinch. I did not look at the paper resting on my plate. I simply kept my eyes fixed on the man who was supposed to protect me, but had spent his entire life tearing me down. I could feel the gaze of the people at the neighboring tables shifting toward us. In the high society circles of Atlanta, a scandal involving the bishop's family was more delicious than the most expensive caviar. My father knew exactly what he was doing by staging this confrontation in public. He wanted to corner me to ensure I had nowhere to run and no way to defend myself without causing a massive scene. Right on cue, my mother Vivian began her performance. She took a pristine white napkin and dabbed delicately at the corners of her eyes, making absolutely sure not to smudge her flawless makeup. "Oh, Marcus," she sighed, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We tried so hard to hide this terrible shame. We prayed for her soul every single day in our church. But as God-fearing Christians, we cannot let a good man like you enter a marriage built on such a horrific lie. She is not the perfect, successful woman she pretends to be." Vivian leaned closer across the table, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier light. When she was 18, she became a complete disgrace to our family name. She got pregnant. She was a wild, reckless teenager throwing away every opportunity we graciously gave her. And do you know what she did when the boy was born? She tossed him into a state-run orphanage like a piece of trash. She did not want the burden of a child holding her back from chasing money and men in the city. We begged her to be a mother to that poor boy, but her heart was entirely frozen. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering. She sat there draped in silk and fake righteousness, completely rewriting history to paint herself as the weeping matriarch and me as the cold-hearted villain. She wanted Marcus to picture a selfish, neglectful teenager dumping a baby to live a life of luxury. She intentionally omitted the part where she and my father had packed my few belongings in black garbage bags and locked me out of the house in the freezing rain. They did not care about a baby back then. They only cared about protecting Iman's spotless reputation and ensuring the church's donation numbers never dropped. I felt Marcus shift slightly in his chair. Anyone else might have demanded an immediate explanation or pulled their hand away from mine in shock. But Marcus did not move away. His thumb gently stroked the back of my hand under the table, a silent promise of absolute solidarity. He looked at my mother, his expression entirely unreadable. He let her finish her theatrical sobbing. He watched as Iman gently rubbed my mother's back, playing the role of the comforting, righteous daughter to absolute perfection. The air in the private dining alcove grew incredibly dense. I glanced at my sister. Iman wore a look of deep, fake sympathy, but her eyes danced with a familiar, vicious triumph. This was her favorite game. For years she had watched our parents crush my spirit to elevate hers. When I got straight grades in high school, it was ignored because Iman had just made the dean's list at her prestigious university. When I started my first investment portfolio, my father called it a foolish gamble while praising Iman for marrying into Bradley's massive generational wealth. Now here they were again trying to annihilate my happiness just days before I finally got my own moment in the sun. My mother took a dramatic breath, steadying herself as if the weight of my supposed sins was physically crushing her. "We love her, Marcus. We really do." Vivian continued, placing a hand right over her heart. "But a woman who can abandon her own flesh and blood, a woman who can leave a helpless infant to the mercy of the foster care system without ever looking back, is not capable of truly loving a husband. She will use you, Marcus. She will drain your resources to fund her little wealth management firm, and when things get difficult, she will abandon you, just like she abandoned that child. We are doing this to save you." The absolute silence that followed her monologue was deafening. The waiter who had been approaching our table with a tray of appetizers immediately pivoted and walked the other way, sensing the explosive atmosphere. My father sat back in his large leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for Marcus to drop my hand, stand up and walk away. He was waiting for the ultimate victory, the moment when the man I loved would look at me with the same utter disgust my family had shown me my entire life. But they vastly underestimated Marcus Sterling. They saw a wealthy tech investor, but they failed to see the sharp, calculating predator underneath his tailored suit. They also severely underestimated me. The scared, defenseless girl they had thrown out into the cold was long gone. In her place was a woman who navigated the ruthless world of high finance, a woman who had built a massive empire by always anticipating her enemies' moves. I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to scream or cry to prove my innocence. I just sat back against the plush velvet booth and let the silence stretch out, allowing their toxic lies to hang suspended in the air. We were waiting for the next player to reveal his hand, and right on cue, the most arrogant man at the table decided he needed to be heard. "In my family, Marcus, we deal with facts." Bradley began, leaning back and resting his arm across the back of Iman's chair. He looked at my fiancé not as an equal, but as a junior partner he was attempting to mentor. The Reynolds name has been built on a foundation of absolute transparency and unblemished reputation. We do not tolerate scandals. We certainly do not tolerate hidden liabilities. And let us be brutally honest here. What we are looking at tonight is a massive liability. He gestured vaguely in my direction with his free hand, not even bothering to make eye contact with me. It was a gesture one might use when pointing out a scuff mark on a luxury car. He was speaking about me as if I were a defective piece of property. It is truly a shame, Bradley continued, a cold smirk playing on his lips. You look at Iman, and you see the absolute pinnacle of what this family is capable of producing. She has the grace, the intellect, the flawless genetic pedigree that belongs in high society. It makes you wonder how two women from the exact same household could turn out so fundamentally different. It seems all the exceptional traits were entirely concentrated in my wife, while the remaining less desirable qualities pooled elsewhere. Iman cast her eyes downward in a display of manufactured modesty, but I could see the sharp, victorious upward curve of her mouth. She fed on his validation. She needed him to publicly diminish me so her own star could shine brighter. Bradley shifted his attention fully back to Marcus, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial businessman to businessman register. You are a venture capitalist, Marcus. You evaluate investments for a living. You know better than anyone that when an asset reveals hidden structural damage, you do not pour more capital into it. You cut your losses. You liquidate. You walk away before the rot spreads to your own portfolio. He leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the table. Do not let blind affection cloud your financial judgment. Ridding yourself of this situation now will save you millions in PR damage control later. You are about to marry a woman who discarded a human life because it inconvenienced her. That is not a partner. That is a ticking time bomb of debt and scandal waiting to detonate in your boardroom. The sheer level of his aristocratic disdain was meant to crush me into the floorboards. My father nodded slowly in solemn agreement, completely endorsing his son-in-law's racist and elitist dog whistles. My mother sighed heavily, clutching her pearl necklace as if Bradley had just delivered the gospel truth. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or defend my teenage self. I let his words settle over the table like a suffocating blanket. I slowly pulled my gaze away from my father and locked eyes with Bradley. The smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as he met my stare. He expected a broken, humiliated girl. He found a predator perfectly still in the grass. A liability, I repeated. The word rolled off my tongue smooth and calculated. I tilted my head slightly, studying him as if he were a particularly uninteresting spreadsheet. You look at me and you see a bad investment. You call my past a stain on your pristine Reynolds legacy. Is that right, Bradley? He bristled at my calm tone, clearly irritated that I was not sobbing or storming out of the restaurant. It is a permanent stain, Zuri, he shot back, his voice losing its polished edge and dipping into raw malice. You are a woman with no true background, no sense of loyalty, and a closet full of filthy secrets. You managed to hustle your way into a little bit of money, and you think that buys you a seat at the adult table. It does not. Money cannot buy class, and it certainly cannot erase the fact that you threw away a bastard child. Iman gasped softly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. Bradley, please, she murmured, her tone dripping with fake gentle concern. Be easy on her. She lacks the emotional capacity to understand what she did. She has always been this way. Cold, selfish. Even when we were children, she only ever cared about her own survival. My sister turned her gaze to Marcus, her eyes wide and pleading. We tried to integrate her into our lives, Marcus. Bradley even offered to help her look over her little firm's tax returns last year to ensure she was not making any amateur mistakes. But she rejected us. She pushes away anyone who tries to shine a light on her shady dealings. We are only telling you all of this because we respect you too much to watch you throw your sterling reputation away on a woman who leaves her own flesh and blood to rot in a state facility. The coordinated attack was seamless. Bradley provided the corporate logical reasoning for why I was garbage. Iman provided the emotional sisterly sorrow to prove I was fundamentally broken. My parents sat as the silent, grieving judges who had tried their best to save my soul, but ultimately had to warn the world about my wicked nature. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I could feel the heat radiating from Marcus beside me. His broad shoulders were tense under his bespoke suit. To anyone else, he looked perfectly calm, but I knew the subtle signs of his fury. The slight clenching of his jaw, the way his breathing slowed down to a predatory rhythm. They thought his silence meant he was reconsidering our marriage. They thought they had successfully planted the seed of doubt. "You speak of stains, Bradley?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume that forced everyone at the table to lean in to hear me. "You speak of bad investments and rot. It is fascinating how much energy you spend evaluating my worth, considering you have never once looked closely at the foundation of your own glass house." My father slammed his hand flat against the table, rattling the silverware. "Do not dare speak to your brother-in-law with that tone, Zuri." Calvin barked, his authoritative church voice flaring up. "He is trying to save this family from the humiliation you are determined to drag us through. You will sit there, you will confess your sins to the man you deceived, and you will accept the consequences of your filthy actions." My mother immediately chimed in, her voice rising in pitch. "We will not allow you to disrespect Bradley. He comes from a family of true integrity. He knows what honor looks like. You have brought nothing but shame to this table since the day you turned 50. I kept my eyes locked on Bradley, ignoring my parents completely. The arrogance radiating from him was practically blinding. He firmly believed his wealth, his race, and his status made him utterly untouchable. He believed he held all the cards ready to watch my life implode right before the appetizers arrived. Marcus finally moved. He slowly uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy mahogany table. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly entertained. The tension in the air was so sharp it could cut glass. The Washington family held their breath, waiting for the wealthy venture capitalist to announce that the wedding was off, to demand his multi-million-dollar ring back and to leave me humiliated and abandoned in the middle of the restaurant. But Marcus did not ask for the ring. He did not slide out of the booth. He turned his head slowly, looking at my father, then at my mother, then at Iman, and finally his gaze settled squarely on Bradley. A slow, chilling smile spread across Marcus's face, the kind of smile a wolf gives a trapped rabbit just before it strikes. Marcus did not blink. He let his chilling smile linger just long enough to make Bradley shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You see, Bradley," Marcus began, his voice completely devoid of the anger my family had anticipated. "Your analogy about evaluating investments is fundamentally flawed. A smart venture capitalist never relies on rumors or the desperate gossip of competitors. A smart investor relies on rigorous, uncompromising due diligence. I do not deal in whispers. I deal in authenticated facts." He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a fluid, relaxed motion. He reached down to the sleek leather briefcase resting against the leg of his chair. He did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, designed to stretch the agonizing silence tightening around my family's throats. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope secured with a tight string. He tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack right next to the flimsy, crumpled paper my father had dramatically presented moments ago. The bold blue seal of the Fulton County Superior Court was stamped clearly across the front of the envelope. My father stared at the seal, the muscles in his jaw ticking. My mother lowered her pristine white napkin. Her manufactured tears vanished instantly, leaving her eyes dry and wide with sudden apprehension. "I know absolutely everything about the boy," Vivian Marcus said. His voice was no longer conversational. It was a low, commanding rumble that cut straight to the bone. "I know much more about him than you ever bothered to learn during the 14 years you pretended he did not exist." My mother swallowed hard, her throat bobbing against her diamond necklace. "Marcus," she started, her voice losing its theatrical sorrow and taking on a thin, reedy quality. "You do not understand the burden she placed on this family. You do not know what we went through." "Do not insult my intelligence by interrupting me," Marcus snapped. The sheer authority in his tone made my mother physically recoil. "You brought me to this restaurant to stage an ambush. You thought you were holding the ultimate trump card. You truly believed you could drop this bomb? Watch me recoil in horror and successfully isolate Zuri, just like you have tried to do her entire life. You thought I would run away from a hidden liability. Marcus turned his hand over, interlocking his fingers tightly with mine on top of the white tablecloth. He looked directly at my father. You failed your due diligence, Calvin. You missed the most critical piece of information. I am not just marrying Zuri, I am legally adopting Trey. My legal team finalized the Supreme Court paperwork this morning. The color rapidly drained from my father's face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He opened his mouth, but his booming church voice completely failed him. No sound came out. Chloe sat paralyzed. Her previously triumphant smirk was completely wiped away, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the ice in her water glass rattled. Liam looked sharply between my parents, then at his wife, and finally back at Marcus. His aristocratic arrogance faltered, replaced by deep, genuine confusion. Trey Liam asked, his brow furrowing in irritation. Who the hell is Trey? Your father-in-law just said the boy was a nameless bastard sent to an orphanage. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, did they conveniently forget to tell you his name, Liam? How fascinating. They left out the most important details of their own fabricated tragedy. Calvin Vivian, would you care to explain to your wealthy son-in-law who Trey really is? Or should I read the court transcripts aloud to the entire restaurant? My parents remained frozen in their plush leather chairs. They looked like statues completely trapped by the very public spectacle they had initiated. They could not scream. They could not cause a scene without destroying their immaculate megachurch reputation in front of Atlanta's elite. They were suffocating in the trap they had built for me. Since the bishop has suddenly lost his legendary ability to speak, I will gladly clarify, Marcus said, leaning closer to the center of the table and tapping his index finger against the thick court file. You mean the child you two cowards forced a 15-year-old Zuri to claim as her own? You mean the innocent infant you used to cover up the filthy, unforgivable truth about the actual golden child sitting right next to you? Chloe's hand jerked violently. Her crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers and tipped over. It shattered against the heavy base of the table lamp. Dark red wine flooded across the pristine white tablecloth, bleeding outward like a fresh, expanding wound. She stared at the spreading red stain, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Liam abruptly pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor. He looked at his wife, his eyes narrowing with a sudden dark suspicion. What is he talking about? Chloe, Liam demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, demanding register. What truth? What is in that file? My father finally found his voice, though it sounded weak and desperate. Marcus, you are listening to the lies of a bitter, jealous woman, Calvin pleaded, gripping the edge of the table. Zuri has manipulated you. She is trying to destroy her sister out of pure spite. We are men of God. We would never commit such a sin. You are a man of cowardice, Marcus corrected him instantly, his voice slicing through my father's pathetic defense. I do not need Zuri's word. I have DNA records. I have hospital birth certificates from 14 years ago. I have sworn affidavits from the private clinic where you quietly sent your precious eldest daughter when her indiscretions threatened your holy empire. I have every single piece of paper required to absolutely annihilate your family's fraudulent legacy. Vivian let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She looked around, frantically terrified that the surrounding tables were listening to the destruction of her life. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers clawing at the air toward the manila envelope. Marcus swiftly pulled the file out of her reach. Do not touch my property, Vivian Marcus warned softly. This file does not belong to you anymore. You do not control the narrative today. Liam turned his entire body to face Chloe. He ignored my parents completely. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles bulged under his skin. Chloe, look at me, Liam ordered. Tell me he is lying. Tell me this is some insane extortion plot your sister cooked up. Chloe could not look at him. She stared fixedly at the shattered glass and the spilled wine, her breath coming in short, panicked hitches. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not the fake, calculated tears my mother had used moments ago. These were tears of absolute terror. The golden pedestal she had stood on her entire life was violently cracking beneath her feet. "Answer me!" Liam raised his voice, drawing the startled glances of a wealthy older couple sitting at the adjacent booth. "Did you have a child?" She was 18. Vivian suddenly blurted out, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "She was a child herself, Liam. She made a mistake with a horrible boy from the wrong side of town. It would have ruined her college admissions. It would have ruined her future. We had to protect her. We had to protect the family name. Zuri was already a difficult child. Nobody would question it if she was the one who fell pregnant. We did what we had to do for the greater good of this family." The sheer monstrous reality of her confession hung over the table. She admitted it. She admitted to taking my life, my reputation, and my teenage years and setting them on fire just to keep Chloe warm. She admitted to kicking a 15-year-old girl out into the streets with a newborn baby that was not even hers, all to protect the image of a megachurch and a golden daughter. Liam stared at Vivian in absolute disgust, then slowly turned his horrified gaze back to his wife. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and profound anger. "Before we got married, I asked you if there was anything in your past that could ever embarrass the Reynolds family. You looked me in the eye and swore your record was spotless. You swore you were pure. You hid a bastard child. You let your teenage sister take the blame while you married into my family under false pretenses." "It was not like that," Chloe sobbed, finally finding her voice. Her hands reached out to grab Liam's arm, but he violently yanked his arm away, treating her touch like a disease. "I had to, Liam. My parents made me do it. I was scared." "You are a fraud," Liam spat out. The generational arrogance in his eyes had turned into pure, unadulterated venom. "You are all frauds." Marcus leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, watching the implosion with cold satisfaction. He looked at me, giving my hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. The trap my parents had so carefully set had completely swallowed them whole. "Zuri and I will be leaving now," Marcus announced, his voice slicing through the sounds of Chloe's desperate sobbing. "We have a wedding to finalize, and Calvin, if you or your wife ever attempt to contact Zuri or Trey again, I will personally ensure this entire file is delivered to every major news outlet in Atlanta by morning. Your congregation will know exactly what kind of monsters are standing behind the pulpit." I stood up smoothly, picking up my purse. I looked down at my parents, who were now shrunken, terrified shadows of the powerful figures they pretended to be. I looked at Chloe, who was frantically trying to apologize to a husband who was already signaling for the waiter to bring the check so he could abandon her. I smiled. It was a small, genuine smile. I did not say a single word. I did not need to. I turned my back on the Washington family and walked out of the restaurant with my hands securely in Marcus's, leaving them to choke on the ashes of their own burning empire. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the cold marble floor. If you were standing right behind me, looking over my shoulder at the glowing screen of my phone, you would see the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in my hand. It was a faint physical vibration, the lingering residue of extreme tension, and the adrenaline crash from the explosive dinner the night before. I was not afraid, but my body was completely wired, functioning on pure survival instinct. My eyes were locked onto a fresh email that had just landed in my inbox, bearing the official crest of the First Trinity Cathedral. First Trinity was the most exclusive, highly coveted wedding venue in all of Atlanta. It was a breathtaking architectural masterpiece where the city's elite gathered to cement their dynasties. I opened the message and read the cold, heavily sanitized corporate language. The Executive Administrative Board was formally notifying me that due to sudden and unforeseen pastoral directives, my reservation for the upcoming weekend was permanently canceled. They were voiding the contract. I had paid a $50,000 deposit 6 months in advance to secure the massive sanctuary, the custom floral arrangements, and the elite choir. The email curtly stated that a full refund would be issued within 30 business days, but the financial aspect was completely irrelevant to me. The underlying message was crystal clear. I was being locked out. First Trinity was the crown jewel of the religious community in Georgia, and its senior pastor was a man who owed his entire elevated career to one person, my father. Before I could even close the email application, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my palm. The incoming call screen flashed brightly, displaying the name Bishop Calvin Washington. He did not wait a single second to gloat. I stared at the name for a brief moment, watching the phone shake slightly in my grip before I swiped to answer and pressed the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited. His breathing was heavy, ragged, with the kind of righteous fury he usually reserved for sinners who dared to defy him in his massive megachurch. When he spoke, his voice was a low, menacing rumble designed to instill absolute terror. "You think you are smart, Zuri?" My father began, the venom dripping from every single syllable. "You think because you have a little bit of money and a rich man standing beside you, that you can humiliate this family in front of polite society? You think you can walk away from that table, disrespect your own blood, and just go on living your perfect little life? You are entirely wrong. I built this city. I built the spiritual foundation of Atlanta, and I hold the keys to every single sanctuary in this state. Did you get the email, Zuri? Did you read it carefully?" I remained completely silent, letting his arrogance echo loudly in the quiet space of my kitchen. My refusal to engage only fueled his rage. He raised his voice, the booming, authoritative tone vibrating harshly through the speaker. "Just in case you are struggling to understand your new reality, let me make it very plain for you." He continued, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. "I made one phone call this morning. Just one. And just like that, the biggest, most prestigious cathedral in the South shut its heavy doors right in your face. You dared to defy this family in front of outsiders. You dared to let that man humiliate your sister and your brother-in-law. And I will not stop with First Trinity. If you think you can just smile and book another venue, you are severely underestimating my reach and my power." He paused, clearly savoring the leverage he believed he held over me. "I sit on the executive council of the Southern Pastoral Association. I know every megachurch pastor, every reverend, and every venue owner who relies on the good graces and the deep pockets of the Christian community. All it takes is one single word from me. One whisper to the board that you are an unstable, deceitful woman who harbors dark, unforgivable sins, and you will be completely blacklisted. Not a single church in Atlanta will dare to host your wedding. Not a single ordained minister in my syndicate will stand at the altar and bless your union. I will personally ensure that your special day becomes a logistical nightmare." The sheer narcissism radiating from the phone was staggering. He was weaponizing his religion, using his sacred platform to orchestrate a petty, vindictive boycott against his own daughter. He was treating the city of Atlanta like his own personal kingdom, acting as the judge, jury, and executioner of my happiness. "You will fix this," my father commanded, delivering his ultimate threat. "You will pick up your phone, and you will call Marcus today. You will tell him that the pressure is too much, that you are calling off the wedding to spare everyone the embarrassment. You will end this quietly and walk away. Cancel the wedding, Zuri. Do it today. Because if you refuse, if you try to fight me on this and force a public spectacle, I will go directly to my pulpit this Sunday. I will look out at my congregation of 20,000 devoted followers, and I will tell them the tragic story of my estranged, deeply troubled daughter. I will spin a narrative so convincing that the entire city will look at you with utter disgust. I will let everyone in Atlanta know that you are nothing but discarded trash. Cancel the wedding, or I will destroy whatever tiny shred of a reputation you think you have built." He waited for me to break. He waited for the heavy silence to crush my resolve. He expected the tears, the frantic apologies, the desperate pleas for a father's mercy. That was his established playbook. That was exactly how he had controlled my mother into submission. That was how he kept Chloe obedient and terrified of stepping out of line. He ruled his household through fear, spiritual intimidation, and the constant threat of public ruin. He isolated his victims until they felt so small and defenseless that they had absolutely no choice but to drop to their knees and beg for his forgiveness. I pulled the phone slowly away from my ear. I looked at the bright red button on the screen, watching the call timer tick upward second by second. I did not give him a single syllable of satisfaction. I did not defend myself, and I certainly did not negotiate with a terrorist. I pressed the red button and hung up the phone, cutting him off mid-breath and leaving him to scream his empty threats into a deadline. I tossed the phone onto the cold marble island and let out a slow, steady breath. The slight tremor in my hand completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. My father thought he had expertly cornered me in a game of social chess. He thought that denying me a church would break my spirit and force me to cancel the most important day of my life. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman I had become during the 14 years since he threw me out. I did not need his churches. I did not need his hypocritical ministers or his grand stained glass sanctuaries. He operated in a fragile world of religious politics, church donations, and social blackmail. I operated in the unforgiving concrete world of pure, unadulterated capital. And in America, capital is the absolute highest power there is. I did not panic. I simply pivoted to a superior strategy. I picked my phone back up, completely ignoring the string of furious text messages that were suddenly flooding in from my father's number. I bypassed my contacts list entirely and manually dialed a private, unlisted number from memory. It was a number that did not belong to a pastor, a bishop, or anyone who cared about church politics. It belonged to Arthur Sterling Marcus's father. Arthur was a ruthless, terrifyingly brilliant real estate magnate who owned half the commercial and private property in the state of Georgia. He was a man whose quiet, invisible influence made my father's loud pulpit look like child's play. My father wanted to play a game of territorial control. He wanted to see who held the most power in Atlanta by locking me out of a building. It was time to show Bishop Calvin Washington exactly what real, untouchable power looked like when it was fully unleashed. The line rang twice before a deep, calm, and incredibly sharp voice answered the phone. Arthur Sterling did not bother with pleasantries. Zuri, the billionaire patriarch, said, his tone as solid and unyielding as granite. Marcus just briefed me on the situation at the restaurant. He also informed me that Calvin is currently attempting to leverage his pastoral syndicate to cancel your venue. I assume that is why you are calling. He succeeded, Arthur. First Trinity just revoked my contract. First Trinity is a building of brick and stained glass run by men who worship donations more than they worship anything else, Arthur replied smoothly. You do not need them. I have already instructed my staff to open the Sterling estate in Buckhead. The gardens are in full bloom, the security is impenetrable, and it is private property. Calvin has absolutely no jurisdiction there. Let him scream from his pulpit. We will celebrate your union on ground he can never touch. The camera of my life panned sharply from that quiet victory directly into the heart of my next battle. Less than an hour later, I stepped through the gilded glass doors of L'Eternité, Atlanta's most exclusive bridal atelier. The bell chimed a soft melodic note, but the atmosphere inside the boutique was entirely toxic. The tracking shot of my arrival would have captured my confident stride, faltering for only a fraction of a second as I took in the scene before me. I had an appointment for my final fitting. Instead, I had walked into a meticulously coordinated ambush. Chloe was lounging on a plush velvet sofa in the center of the showroom, casually crossing her legs. She was surrounded by three of her most prominent sorority sisters, a viciously exclusive group of high society women who had spent their entire college careers making sure I was blacklisted from every meaningful social event. They were sipping complimentary champagne from crystal flutes, their laughter echoing sharply against the mirrored walls. Standing behind the glass counter was Genevieve, the normally poised and elegant owner of the boutique. Today, Genevieve looked absolutely terrified. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a sleek black American Express card, Liam's card. Hanging on the premier display mannequin in the center of the room was my wedding dress. It was a custom-designed masterpiece I had spent months collaborating on, a flawless silhouette of imported silk and delicate French lace. It was the dress I was supposed to marry Marcus in. Now Chloe was pointing a manicured finger at it, issuing a command to the trembling boutique owner. "Package it up, Genevieve," Chloe said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "I want it altered to a cocktail length by tomorrow. I am wearing it to the hospital charity gala this weekend." I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. "That is a custom bridal gown, Chloe. It belongs to me." Chloe stood up, handing her champagne flute to one of her sycophantic friends. She turned to face me, and the sheer malice radiating from her was suffocating. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning me from head to toe with profound disgust. "Beautiful things are only for those who deserve them, Zuri," Chloe said, her voice carrying across the silent boutique. "You have no family. You have no background. You have absolutely no moral standing. What do you possibly have to go against me? Did you honestly think you could embarrass me in front of my husband and just walk away to play the blushing bride? You are nothing. You have always been nothing. I am simply putting you back in your proper place." One of her sorority sisters, a woman named Vanessa, whose husband was a prominent state senator, stepped up beside Chloe. "She is right, Zuri," Vanessa sneered, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "You never belonged in our circles. We saw right through you back at the university. You were always the outcast, the dirty little secret the Washington family tried to hide. Chloe is doing society a favor by stripping you of this ridiculous fantasy. You do not get the fairy tale." I shifted my gaze to the boutique owner. "Genevieve, I paid for that dress in full 3 months ago. Explain to me why my sister is currently attempting to butcher it for a charity gala." Genevieve swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously between me and the black card in her hand. "I am so sorry, Zuri. I really am. But Chloe came in and offered me triple the price of the gown in cash. She also made it very clear that if I did not comply, she and her entire network would boycott my atelier. She threatened to ruin my reputation among the church elite and the country club members. I cannot afford to lose my entire client base over one dress. I am refunding your money right now." It was a classic Washington family maneuver. They weaponized their social capital to terrorize innocent business owners into submission. Chloe thought she had won. She stood there flanked by her wealthy friends, armed with her husband's limitless credit limit, entirely convinced that she had successfully humiliated me and stolen my joy. She was waiting for me to break down, to scream, to cause a scene that would only validate her narrative that I was an unstable, aggressive woman. I did not give her that satisfaction. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my phone. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Chloe with the cold, analytical detachment of a crisis manager assessing a very fragile, very foolish opponent. "You are relying on Liam's money to fight your battles," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You are using his black card to throw a tantrum because you are terrified. You are terrified because Liam left that restaurant last night looking at you like you were a monster. How long do you think he will let you swipe that card once his own family lawyers finish reviewing the Supreme Court file detailing your teenage pregnancy and your parents' subsequent cover-up?" Chloe's smug expression cracked. The mention of her crumbling marriage was a direct hit to her weakest point. Her sorority sisters exchanged confused, nervous glances. Chloe had clearly not told them the truth about what happened at the steakhouse. She had likely spun a story about me attacking her unprovoked. I turned my attention back to the boutique owner. "Genevieve, you are worried about losing your elite clientele. You are worried about Chloe ruining your reputation. I suggest you worry about your lease instead." Genevieve frowned, her hands tightening around the credit card. "My lease. This building is owned by Vanguard Commercial Properties," I stated smoothly, citing the real estate data I had memorized months ago when Marcus and I first toured the area. "Your current lease agreement expires in exactly 35 days. Vanguard Commercial Properties was quietly acquired last week by the Sterling Real Estate Conglomerate. The CEO of that conglomerate is Arthur Sterling, my future father-in-law." The color completely drained from Genevieve's face. The three sorority sisters suddenly stood incredibly still. They all knew exactly who Arthur Sterling was. His power in Atlanta was absolute and entirely unforgiving. I just got off the phone with Arthur. I continued, taking a slow step closer to the counter. He is very protective of his family. If you swipe Liam's card and hand my wedding dress to a woman who is actively attempting to sabotage my marriage, your lease will not be renewed. You will have 30 days to vacate this premium retail space, and I guarantee you will not find another landlord in this district willing to cross the Sterling family to take you in. Chloe can promise you a boycott. I can promise you an eviction. The silence in the boutique was absolute. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air felt thin. Chloe stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the scale of the counterattack. She had brought a high society boycott to a corporate real estate war. Genevieve did not hesitate for another second. She slammed the black American Express card down on the glass counter and forcefully slid it back toward Chloe. "Take your card, Chloe," Genevieve said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I am not selling you this dress. Please leave my store immediately." Chloe's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. She snatched the card off the counter, her hands shaking with rage. She turned to her sorority sisters, expecting them to rally behind her, expecting them to launch a verbal assault on my character to defend her honor. But the women were already backing away. Vanessa, the senator's wife, deliberately avoided Chloe's gaze. They were wealthy, but they were not foolish. They recognized true power when it was standing right in front of them. Nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire of the Sterling family's wrath. They silently gathered their designer bags and moved toward the exit, abandoning Chloe entirely. "You think you have won," Chloe hissed at me, her voice dropping to a desperate, venomous whisper. "You think having Marcus's family behind you erases what you are. It does not. I will find another way to break you." "You have nothing left to break me with," I replied coldly. "Your church venue is gone. Your social threats are useless. Your husband is disgusted by you. You are a fraud, Chloe, and the entire world is about to find out." Chloe let out a frustrated, humiliated sound. She spun around and stormed out of the boutique, pushing past the heavy glass doors and disappearing onto the busy street. I stood perfectly still, watching her run away, knowing that I had just dismantled another piece of the Washington family's toxic empire. Genevieve quickly stepped out from behind the counter. She carefully lifted my custom silk and lace gown from the display mannequin and brought it over to me. She was profusely apologizing, her eyes wide with fear and respect. I accepted her apology gracefully. I took my dress carefully enclosed in its protective garment bag and walked out into the warm Atlanta sunlight. I had my dress. I had my venue. I had my fiancé. I had won the morning. But as I reached my car, my phone rang again. It was Marcus. I answered immediately, expecting him to confirm the new details for the Sterling estate. Instead, his voice was tight-layered with a dark, urgent energy I had never heard before. "Zuri, get to my office right now," Marcus ordered sharply. "Your father did not just go after the church venue, he found out where we are keeping Trey." "Zuri, get to my office right now," Marcus ordered sharply. "Your father did not just go after the church venue. He found out where we are keeping Trey. Secure the perimeter." I told Marcus, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of any panic despite the sudden ice flooding my veins. "Put every guard on high alert. If Calvin or anyone from his congregation steps within a mile of that campus, I want them detained immediately. I am on my way." I ended the call and reached for the chrome handle of my car door. Before my fingers could make contact, a sharp, triumphant laugh cut through the ambient noise of the Atlanta traffic. I turned slowly. Marching out of the gilded glass doors of L'Eternité was Iman, flanked by Bradley. In her hand, clutched like a hunting trophy, was the heavy black garment bag containing my custom silk wedding gown. Genevieve, the boutique owner, trailed behind them. She stood in the doorway, wringing her hands, looking utterly defeated and deeply ashamed. Bradley had clearly stepped in after I walked away. He had undoubtedly thrown the full weight of the Reynolds family name around, promising endless legal ruin, zoning board harassment, and a complete high society boycott if she did not hand over the dress to his wife. Genevieve, a small business owner terrified of local old money, had caved to the immediate threat, completely underestimating the promise I had made to her just minutes prior. Iman strutted across the pavement, stopping just inches from my personal space. The bright afternoon sun caught the massive diamond on her finger as she held the garment bag up for me to see. "Did you honestly think a hollow threat about a commercial lease would stop us?" Iman sneered, her voice carrying a sickeningly sweet tone of victory. "Bradley's attorneys can tie up an eviction notice in court for years." Genevieve realized who truly holds the power in this city. You can try to play the intimidating corporate boss Zuri, but you are out of your depth. Bradley stood slightly behind her, looking thoroughly amused by the spectacle. He adjusted his silk tie, projecting the aura of a man who believed he had just effortlessly swatted away a minor annoyance. "We are simply taking what rightfully belongs to our social circle," Bradley added, his tone dripping with elitist condescension. "You tried to overstep your boundaries. We are just correcting the error. My wife needs a cocktail dress for the hospital charity gala this weekend. This fabric will do nicely once my tailor cuts it down." Iman smiled, her eyes gleaming with pure malice. "Beautiful things are only for those who deserve them, Zuri. You have no family, you have no background, you have no real power. You are just a stray dog who wandered into a mansion. What do you possibly have to go against me?" I did not yell. I did not attempt to snatch the bag from her hands. I stood perfectly still, letting the ambient noise of the street fade away until the only sound I focused on was the rhythmic, arrogant breathing of my sister. My eyes locked onto hers with the cold, analytical precision of a predator measuring its prey. "No background," I repeated softly. The words were sharp, carrying no emotion, only absolute certainty. "You say I have no background." I reached back into my purse and pulled out my phone. I did not bypass my contacts to dial a local lawyer or a local landlord. I dialed a direct private line in Paris. It was the personal number of Eleanor Vance, the global CEO and brand manager of the multinational luxury conglomerate that owned L'Eternité. The phone rang exactly once. Zuri darling Eleanor's crisp French-accented voice answered immediately. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Eleanor," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the pavement, ensuring Iman and Bradley caught every single word. "I am standing outside your Atlanta flagship location. A local woman named Iman Reynolds, accompanied by her husband Bradley, is currently holding my custom bridal gown. They have intimidated your local franchisee into handing over paid merchandise. They are threatening the boutique with a local boycott. I need the situation rectified immediately." The warmth in Eleanor's voice vanished, replaced by an Arctic corporate efficiency. "Give me 10 minutes, Zuri." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag. I leaned back against the frame of my car and crossed my arms. "Who did you call?" Bradley mocked, a harsh laugh escaping his throat. "A customer service hotline, the Better Business Bureau. You are embarrassing yourself, Zuri. We are leaving." But they did not leave. A strange magnetic tension held them there. They wanted to bask in their perceived victory, waiting to see if I would finally break down and cry. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me beg for my dress. I simply stared at them, watching the seconds tick by on my watch. Exactly 9 minutes later, a sleek black armored SUV pulled aggressively up to the curb, its tires screeching slightly as it stopped directly in front of the boutique. The back door flew open, and a tall, severely dressed woman stepped out. It was the regional director of the entire Southeast Division for the luxury conglomerate. She did not look at Genevieve, who was now weeping quietly in the doorway. She marched straight up to Iman with the relentless momentum of a freight train. Without a single word of greeting, the regional director reached out and firmly snatched the black garment bag right out of Iman's manicured grip. "Excuse me, what the hell are you doing?" Iman shrieked, stumbling backward in shock. "I am confiscating stolen property," the director stated coldly, holding the bag safely behind her back. She turned her steely gaze to Bradley, who was puffing up his chest in indignation. Mr. Reynolds, as of this exact moment, you, your wife, and the entire extended Reynolds family are permanently blacklisted from L'Eternité and all 74 of our affiliated global luxury brands. Your accounts have been frozen. Your purchasing privileges are revoked. Any future orders you attempt to place anywhere in the world will be immediately canceled. Bradley's face went a dangerous shade of purple. The sheer audacity of being spoken to this way in his own city was causing his brain to short-circuit. "You cannot do this," he bellowed, stepping aggressively toward the director. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will buy this entire pathetic brand and personally fire you. I will ruin this company." The regional director offered him a pitying, deeply condescending smile. It was the exact same smile he had given me at the restaurant the night before. "You cannot afford us, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice dripping with absolute certainty. "But more importantly, you have gravely insulted our largest private shareholder." The director turned away from Bradley and bowed her head slightly toward me in a profound display of corporate deference. "Miss Washington holds a 40% controlling stake in our parent company. She does not just wear the brand Mr. Reynolds, she owns the brand. You tried to steal a dress from the woman who signs my CEO's paychecks." Iman's jaw literally dropped. The breath physically left her body in a sharp, painful gasp. Bradley staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. The realization hit them simultaneously. They had tried to use their generational local wealth to bully a woman who quietly controlled a global financial empire. The power disparity was not just vast, it was astronomical. They were utterly comprehensively powerless. I uncrossed my arms and walked over to the regional director. I took the garment bag from her hands, thanking her with a brief nod. I opened the back door of my car and laid the dress carefully across the leather seats. I turned back to look at my sister one last time. Aman's face was completely contorted. The smug aristocratic superiority had been entirely burned away, leaving behind a mixture of profound, inescapable humiliation and an unchecked, feral rage. Her hands were curled into tight fists at her sides, shaking violently. She had lost the church venue. She had lost the battle for the dress. She had lost her dignity on a public sidewalk. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I watched through the window as Bradley forcefully gripped Aman's arm, pulling her close to his side. They were whispering frantically to each other, their faces pale and desperate. I knew exactly what that look meant. They were entirely out of options. They had been stripped of their money, their influence, and their social leverage, which meant they were about to do something reckless. If they could not stop the wedding with their checkbooks or their pastors, they would use their final, most destructive weapon. They were going to weaponize the rehearsal dinner. I could see the desperate, vicious plan forming in Iman's eyes. She was going to stand up in front of Marcus's entire extended family, the formidable Sterling dynasty, and announce the twisted, fabricated truth about Trey. She was going to frame me as a monster, hoping the resulting scandal would finally force Arthur Sterling to demand his son call off the wedding. They thought the rehearsal dinner would be my execution. I shifted the car into drive, my mind already 10 steps ahead, accelerating into the traffic to secure my child. Let them try. The heavy oak double doors of the Sterling Estate's grand banquet hall did not just open. They were violently shoved apart, the brass handles slamming against the interior walls with a deafening crack. Following closely behind them, watching the chaotic rhythm of their aggressive strides, you could see the exact moment the Washington family decided to wage a holy war on private property. Calvin marched at the forefront, his posture rigidly straight, projecting the manufactured booming authority of a bishop leading a righteous crusade. Vivian clung tightly to his left arm, her face already twisted into a mask of tragic maternal grief. Right behind them strutted Iman and Bradley. They did not come alone. Calvin had dragged 3 senior members of his church board along to serve as his personal jury. Deacon Miller, Elder Hayes, and Brother Vance trailed behind the family, their expressions stern and judgmental. They were brought here to bear witness to my ultimate humiliation, serving as the official audience who would report back to the congregation that the bishop had successfully excised a demon from their flock. The banquet hall was a masterpiece of understated, terrifying wealth. Arthur Sterling did not believe in flashy displays. He believed in exclusivity. The room was softly illuminated by hundreds of floating candles reflecting off the flawless crystal glassware and the polished silver cutlery. A string quartet played quietly in the corner, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the low melodic hum of conversation among Atlanta's true elite. The Washington family's entrance shattered that atmosphere instantly. The string quartet faltered, the cellist pulling his bow away from the strings with a harsh screech. The clinking of silver against fine china ceased entirely. Every eye in the room turned toward the doorway, watching the uninvited guests trespass into a highly secured private event. I stood near the head table with Marcus, my hand resting lightly on his arm. We had already secured Trey. Marcus's security team had intercepted my father's scouts miles away from the campus perimeter, locking the property down with absolute military precision. Trey was safe playing video games in a secured wing of the estate, completely oblivious to the chaos brewing downstairs. My family had no idea that their primary weapon had already been neutralized. They walked into the room entirely convinced they were holding a loaded gun. Bradley took the lead. He completely ignored Marcus and me, his eyes scanning the room until he locked onto the most powerful figures present. He spotted Marcus's parents, Arthur and Victoria Sterling, standing near the grand fireplace. Bradley adjusted his silk tie, his chin tilted upward in a display of supreme, unearned arrogance. He possessed the specific, dangerous confidence of a man who firmly believed his race, his country club memberships, and his generational wealth granted him immediate kinship with any billionaire in the room. He motioned for Iman to follow him, stepping around the beautifully decorated tables as if he owned the entire estate. Arthur Sterling watched Bradley approach with the cold, unblinking stillness of a great white shark observing a remarkably loud, remarkably foolish fish. Arthur held a glass of bourbon, his expression utterly unreadable. Victoria stood beside him, her posture regal, her eyes narrowing slightly at the vulgar disruption. Bradley stopped directly in front of them, projecting an air of white elitist solidarity. He extended his hand toward Arthur, forcing a tight conspiratorial smile. Arthur did not take it. He simply stared at Bradley's outstretched hand until Bradley, flushing slightly, pulled it back and cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling." Bradley began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent banquet hall. "I apologize for the abrupt nature of this intrusion. My name is Bradley Reynolds. I am Iman's husband and, unfortunately, Zuri's brother-in-law. We did not come here to cause a scene. We came here as a matter of honor to perform a necessary intervention. We came to offer you a favor." Arthur took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. "A favor," Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You trespass into my home, interrupt my son's rehearsal dinner, and you call it a favor." "A necessary evil," Sir Bradley insisted, leaning in slightly, attempting to establish a peer-to-peer dynamic. "In my family, the Reynolds family, we understand the absolute necessity of protecting a legacy. We know what it means to guard a pristine reputation against outside contamination. You are welcoming a woman into your family tonight without knowing the horrific liabilities attached to her name. We could not in good conscience allow the Sterling dynasty to be humiliated by a woman who lacks basic human decency." Iman stepped forward right on cue, pressing a delicate tissue to the corner of her perfectly dry eye. "It breaks our hearts to do this," Iman murmured, projecting her voice just enough for the church board members to hear her profound sorrow. "Zuri is my sister. We have prayed for her soul for over a decade. My father, the bishop, has shed endless tears over her rebellion, but we cannot let your wonderful son marry a woman who lives such a dark, deceitful life. She has lied to Marcus. She has lied to all of you." "She is a master manipulator," Bradley added, placing a protective hand on his wife's lower back. "She operates in the shadows, hustling her way into boardrooms and bank accounts, pretending to be a self-made success. But underneath that cheap corporate facade is a history of utter moral bankruptcy. We are here to warn you, Mr. Sterling, before your family's assets become entangled with hers. Zuri has a secret A very dirty, very permanent secret that she has successfully hidden from polite society. Deacon Miller and Elder Hayes nodded solemnly in the background, crossing their arms over their chests, completely validating the character assassination. My mother, Vivian, let out a soft, dramatic sob, clutching my father's arm, as if the sheer weight of my sins was physically crushing her. "What exactly is this terrible secret, Mr. Reynolds?" Arthur asked, his tone so deceptively mild that anyone else would have recognized the trap. But Bradley was too drunk on his own perceived superiority to notice the absolute peril he was placing himself in. 14 years ago, Bradley announced, his voice ringing with aristocratic disdain, Zuri threw away a human life to protect her own selfish interests. She became pregnant as a teenager. A reckless, shameful mistake. And instead of taking responsibility, instead of seeking the grace of her family's church, she birthed a bastard child and discarded him. She dumped him into a state facility and walked away to chase money and status in the city. She abandoned her own flesh and blood. Bradley paused, letting the word bastard hang heavily in the pristine air of the banquet hall. He looked at Arthur, expecting to see horror. He expected the billionaire patriarch to immediately summon his security team, point a finger at me, and throw me out into the street. He expected the ultimate defining victory that would cement Iman as the only respectable daughter and prove that his elitist judgment was flawless. "You are about to allow your son to marry a woman who left her child to rot," Bradley concluded, a cold, victorious smirk playing on his lips. "We are simply giving you the facts, Mr. Sterling, so you can cut your losses and cancel this wedding before her filth permanently stains your name." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. No one gasped. No one whispered. The entire room of Marcus's relatives and closest allies simply stared at Bradley as if he had just lost his mind. I stood next to Marcus, my posture relaxed, my expression entirely calm. I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to scream or present my evidence. The trap had already been set, and Bradley had just happily locked himself inside it. Arthur Sterling slowly lowered his glass of bourbon. He did not look at Bradley. He looked past him, his eyes finding my father, who was standing tall and proud, waiting for my destruction. Arthur's face remained a mask of icy composure, but the temperature in the room plummeted. The predator was no longer observing. He was preparing to strike. If you were watching this unfold through a camera lens, the shot would be a slow, agonizingly close push into Vivian Washington's face. The tight focus would capture her lips painted a conservative shade of rose, curving upward into a microscopic, highly toxic smile. It was the fleeting, uncontrollable smirk of a narcissist who firmly believed she was about to deliver a fatal public execution. Then the camera would execute a rapid, jarring cut directly to my own face. Cold, unflinching, carved from absolute ice. I did not blink. I did not breathe. I simply stood in the center of the glittering Sterling banquet hall and watched my mother dig her own grave. The terrifying silence Bradley had created was not the reaction my family had calculated. They had expected immediate, chaotic outrage directed squarely at me. They expected Arthur Sterling to summon his security and demand I be thrown out into the street. Instead, they were drowning in the freezing, absolute judgment of the Sterling dynasty. Arthur had not reacted with horror. He had reacted with the lethal stillness of a predator. Sensing the dangerous shift in the room's energy, my mother panicked. She could not handle losing control of the narrative. Vivian tore herself away from my father's side, pushing past Bradley with a frantic energy. She rushed toward the small stage at the front of the banquet hall, where the string quartet had been playing. She practically shoved the cellist aside, grabbing the silver microphone off its stand with trembling, manicured hands. The feedback shrieked through the high-end sound system, causing several wealthy guests to wince and cover their ears. Vivian completely ignored it. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and when she opened them, the malicious smirk was entirely gone. In its place was the flawless, terrifyingly convincing mask of a heartbroken, deeply devout mother. It was the exact same mask she wore every Sunday when she sat in the front pew of First Trinity. "Please," Vivian cried into the microphone, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The sound was engineered to be pathetic pleading dripping with manufactured agony. "Please forgive my son-in-law." Bradley speaks out of protective anger, but he speaks the tragic truth. As a mother, my soul has been bleeding for 14 years. I have carried this heavy burden in silence to protect her, but I can no longer be complicit in her deception. She looked out at the sea of powerful faces, her eyes brimming with fresh, highly calibrated tears. She locked eyes with Victoria Sterling, attempting to establish some kind of twisted high society maternal solidarity. "Victoria Arthur," my mother wept, her voice cracking with the immense strain of her performance. "For the love of God, I cannot stand by and let the Sterling family be deceived. We are a family of faith. We are a family of truth." I tried to save my daughter. I prayed over her day and night, begging the Lord to soften her heart. But Zuri's soul was corrupted by worldly desires and relentless ambition. I felt Marcus shift beside me, the muscles in his jaw ticking furiously. He stepped forward, his hand raising to signal his security team to drag her off the stage, but I pressed my palm firmly against his chest. I did not want her stopped. I wanted her to empty her entire arsenal. I wanted every single person in this room to witness the absolute depravity of the Washington family before I dismantled them. "Zuri has hidden a bastard child for 14 years, Vivian wailed, her voice reaching a fever pitch of theatrical despair. She clutched her chest as if her heart was physically breaking beneath her designer silk dress. An innocent boy. She became pregnant as a reckless teenager and brought unimaginable shame upon our ministry. But we offered her grace. Calvin and I offered to raise the boy quietly to protect her future. Instead, she threw that precious baby into a state orphanage." Vivian paused, letting a dramatic sob tear through the microphone. She discarded her own flesh and blood so she could freely pursue money status. "And this lavish lifestyle," Vivian continued, pointing a shaking finger at the crystal chandeliers above us. "She erased her own son so she could trap Marcus. She is a predator manipulating all of you to secure her place in this family." The murmurs finally began. A low, uneasy wave of whispering rippled through the Sterling guests. But this was not the shock of people believing her vicious lie. This was the profound shock of people witnessing a mother publicly attempt to destroy her own daughter at a rehearsal dinner. They were looking at Vivian with a mixture of horror and deep aristocratic distaste. Vivian misinterpreted their reaction entirely. Drunk on her own perceived righteousness and years of unchecked manipulation, she thought she was winning. She thought the murmurs were the sounds of an audience turning against me. She decided it was time to deliver her grand finale. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her posture suddenly straightening with a burst of vindictive energy. She pointed directly at me, her eyes flashing with a triumphant, malicious fire. She thought she could hide her sins from polite society. Vivian declared, her voice booming through the speakers with the cadence of a fire and brimstone preacher. She thought she could leave that boy in the shadows forever, but the Lord brings all things to the light. We could not let Marcus marry a monster. Today we went to that facility. Today we rescued that poor abandoned boy. Today I have brought that child here." Vivian dramatically extended her free hand, pointing violently toward the heavy oak double doors at the back of the banquet hall. "Bring him in!" "Calvin," Vivian cried out, signaling her husband and the church board members who had gathered near the entrance. "Show them the truth. Show them the boy she threw away." This was the climax of their 14-year campaign of psychological torture. They had spent their entire lives treating me like disposable trash, casting me out, when I refused to submit to their hypocritical reign, and now they believed they had successfully weaponized a child to permanently obliterate my future. Every head in the banquet hall turned toward the heavy double doors. The silence was so profound you could hear the wax dripping from the floating candles. My father, Bishop Calvin Washington, puffed out his chest, stepping fully into his role as the righteous savior. He signaled to Deacon Miller and Elder Hayes. He gripped the brass handles and yanked the heavy doors open fully, expecting to pull a traumatized, confused 14-year-old boy into the blinding light of the ballroom to serve as the ultimate prop in their sick, twisted play. But the doorway was completely empty. There was no child. There was no dramatic revelation. There was only the long, dimly lit marble corridor of the Sterling estate, guarded by two very large, very quiet men in immaculate black suits. Calvin froze, his hands still gripping the brass handles. He looked left then right, panic suddenly flashing across his traditionally stoic face. He stepped out into the corridor, his booming voice echoing back into the silent ballroom. "Where is the boy?" Calvin hissed furiously at empty air. "Where is the security detail we brought? I told you to bring him from the van." Vivian's hand slowly lowered from the air. The microphone squeaked harshly against the fabric of her dress. The triumphant gleam in her eyes shattered instantly, replaced by a frantic, wild confusion. She looked at Bradley, who was suddenly furiously tapping at his cell phone, his face draining of all color. I finally moved. I stepped away from Marcus, my heels clicking softly, methodically against the hardwood floor. I walked past the silent guests, past Arthur and Victoria, and stopped right in the center of the room. I looked directly at my mother, who was now trembling for real. "You are looking for Trey," I said. My voice was not amplified by a microphone, but the absolute chilling authority in my tone carried to every single corner of the room. Vivian flinched as if the sound of my voice had physically burned her. "You sent your church thugs to the private care facility where Marcus and I relocated Trey last month." I continued, my words landing like slow, deliberate strikes of a hammer. "You thought you could bribe a night nurse, drag a terrified 14-year-old boy out of his bed, and parade him in front of Atlanta's elite to humiliate me." I tilted my head, studying the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from my parents. "Did you honestly believe I would leave the most precious person in my life unprotected? Did you think I would allow the same people who threw me out on the street to lay a single finger on my brother?" The word echoed through the hall. "Brother." Bradley's head snapped up. Vivian gasped, taking a stumbling step backward on the stage. The lie they had just broadcast to the entire room, that Trey was my abandoned, illegitimate son, was instantly incinerated. "He is not my son, Vivian. And you know it," I stated, my voice ringing with a 14-year-old rage that I had finally allowed to surface. "Trey is your son. He is the child you and Calvin had out of wedlock before your grand, highly publicized church wedding. He is the child you dumped in a state facility because a disabled infant did not fit the pristine, holy narrative of Bishop Calvin Washington's rise to power. He is the brother I discovered, the brother I financially supported in secret, and the brother you abandoned to rot so you could keep your mansion and your megachurch." I took another step closer to the stage, the proximity forcing Vivian to shrink back against the microphone stand. "You did not bring him here today," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet whisper, "because Marcus's security team intercepted your pathetic church scouts 3 miles down the road. They have been detained. Trey has been on this estate under armed guard for the last 6 hours. He is upstairs right now eating ice cream and playing video games, completely untouched by your toxicity." I turned my back on my mother, completely dismissing her existence, and looked at Arthur Sterling. The billionaire patriarch had not moved a muscle. He was looking at my parents with a level of absolute disgust usually reserved for toxic waste. "I apologize for the disturbance, Arthur," I said smoothly, my composure immaculate. "My family has a habit of creating a mess when they realize they have lost control. It seems they forgot that they are no longer the most powerful people in the room." The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the banquet hall did not slam this time. They swung inward with a slow, deliberate glide, operated by the unseen hands of the estate security staff. The warm, golden light from the outer corridor flooded the entryway, casting a long, imposing shadow across the polished floor. Out of that blinding backlight stepped a silhouette. For a fraction of a second, the Washington family clung desperately to their delusion. Vivian let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, her hands flying to her cheeks. She genuinely believed that this was it. She believed her manufactured narrative was about to be validated. She expected security guards to drag in a terrified, uneducated, broken ward of the state. She wanted a dirty secret she could point at to prove I was unfit for high society. Iman stood beside her mother, quickly covering her mouth with her hand to hide a vicious, triumphant smirk. Bradley aggressively crossed his arms over his chest, rocking back on his heels. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for the grand collapse of my entire existence. They were ready for a tragedy. They were ready for my humiliation. Then the silhouette stepped fully into the light of the crystal chandeliers. The collective breath of the Washington family hitched in their throats. The young man walking down the center aisle of the ballroom was not a broken orphan. He was a 14-year-old aristocrat. Trey moved with an effortless, terrifyingly poised grace. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored midnight blue Savile Row suit that draped flawlessly over his frame. A crisp white shirt, a subtle silk tie, and polished Oxford shoes completed the aesthetic of a young man who had been raised in the corridors of absolute privilege. His posture was immaculate. His chin was held high. His dark eyes scanned the room with the calm, analytical intelligence of a CEO assessing a boardroom. He did not look lost. He looked like he owned the building. As Trey walked down the aisle, the reality of the situation began to fracture my mother's mind. Vivian stepped forward, her maternal instincts completely warped by her narcissistic need for attention. She reached out a trembling hand, preparing to launch into a tearful, redemptive monologue. She was ready to claim him to play the role of the weeping, reunited mother for the wealthy audience. Trey did not even break his stride. He walked past Vivian as if she were a piece of completely irrelevant, outdated furniture. He did not flinch. He did not look at her. The sheer freezing indifference of his passing left Vivian physically staggered. Her outstretched hand fell limply to her side, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Trey bypassed Calvin. He bypassed Iman. He bypassed Bradley. He walked straight past the entire syndicate of church board members arriving directly in front of the head table. He stopped in front of Marcus, offering my fiancé a firm, familiar handshake and a respectful nod. Then Trey turned to me. The cool, analytical detachment vanished from his face, entirely replaced by a radiant, genuine warmth. He offered me a bright, completely unburdened smile. "Mom," Trey said, his clear voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silence of the ballroom. "I am a little late to the dinner. The helicopter from Switzerland had a nasty headwind coming over the coast, but the pilot made up for lost time." The words dropped into the center of the room like a series of targeted explosive charges. Mom, helicopter, Switzerland. Iman's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an explanation that her limited worldview could not provide. Bradley uncrossed his arms, his rigid posture crumbling as he took a heavy step backward. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine. Calvin stood frozen, his pastoral authority entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified old man. Vivian literally collapsed into one of the empty dining chairs. She stared at Trey, staring at the custom suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, and the undeniable aura of wealth that surrounded him. Her brain simply could not process the data. I reached out and gently straightened the lapel of Trey's suit, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "You are right on time, sweetheart," I told him, keeping my voice soft but entirely audible to the paralyzed audience. "Go grab your seat. The chef saved you a plate." Trey smiled again, completely ignoring the hyperventilating family standing just 10 feet away, and moved gracefully to his reserved seat next to Victoria Sterling. Victoria immediately leaned over, placing a warm, affectionate hand on his shoulder and asking him a quiet question about his flight. I turned slowly back to face my biological family. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to drown in the absolute failure of their grand sabotage. "You called him a bastard," I said, directing my gaze precisely at Bradley. "You called him a dirty secret. You assumed because my parents discarded him that he lived a life of poverty and shame. You fundamentally underestimated me. Biology does not make a mother. Sacrifice, protection, and unconditional devotion make a mother." I shifted my focus to Vivian, who was openly weeping now, but not for the cameras. She was crying out of profound, inescapable humiliation. "When you and Calvin discovered that your secret son was born with a minor physical complication, you panicked," I stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You realized a child requiring physical therapy, and dedicated medical attention did not fit the pristine, highly marketable image of a rising megachurch bishop. So you dumped him in a state facility. You signed away your rights to protect your donations. I took a step forward, the sheer force of my 14-year-old rage pressing down on them, but I did not leave him there. The day I turned 18, I used every single dollar I earned to fight the state for legal guardianship. I worked 3 jobs, I slept 4 hours a night. I built my company from the ground up specifically to ensure that boy would never want for anything. I paid for his surgeries. I paid for his physical therapy. And when my company went global, I sent him to l'Institut Le Rose in Switzerland, the most exclusive, fiercely protected educational institution on the planet. I gave him the world you tried to deny him. Bradley stepped forward, his face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He was desperately trying to salvage some shred of his shattered ego. You expect us to believe this? Bradley demanded, his voice cracking with panic. You expect us to believe you funded a Swiss education and private helicopters? You are a fraud, Zuri. This is a setup. Arthur Sterling stepped out from the shadows near the fireplace. The billionaire patriarch held his glass of bourbon perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Bradley with the terrifying intensity of a sniper. Mr. Reynolds? Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register. My personal aviation crew handled Trey's transport from Geneva to Atlanta this afternoon. I personally secured his flight clearance. I personally arranged the security detail that intercepted your pathetic trespassing church scouts at my property line. I know exactly who Zuri is. I know exactly what she has built. My family embraces her history because it is a history of profound honor and unimaginable strength. Arthur took a slow step toward Bradley, the sheer weight of his presence forcing the younger man to shrink backward. You came into my home to expose a secret. Arthur continued, his tone devoid of any mercy. You succeeded. You exposed the fact that the Washington family is entirely morally bankrupt. You exposed the fact that you are a small, insignificant man, desperately trying to tear down a woman who has achieved more in her youth than you will achieve in your entire miserable lifetime. Arthur turned his attention to Calvin and Vivian. His lip curled in genuine disgust. If any of you ever approach my daughter-in-law again, Arthur promised, his voice echoing with absolute finality. If you ever attempt to contact my grandson Trey, if you ever breathe their names in public or in private, I will not simply ruin your church. I will dismantle every financial asset, every political connection, and every social privilege you possess. I will erase your entire dynasty from the map of this city. The air in the room was completely suffocated by Arthur's promise. It was not a threat, it was a guarantee. I looked at Iman. She was trembling violently, her eyes locked onto the floor. She had brought a lie to a war of absolute truth. She had tried to humiliate me using the child I had protected with my life, and in doing so, she had handed me the exact weapon I needed to permanently sever their ties to my existence. Security! Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. His hand rested firmly on the small of my back, a solid wall of support. Remove these trespassers from the estate. If they resist, involve local law enforcement. 6 massive men in dark suits immediately stepped out from the perimeter of the ballroom, moving with rapid, synchronized efficiency. They converged on the Washington family, forming an impenetrable wall around them. Calvin tried to straighten his jacket, attempting to salvage a fraction of his pastoral dignity. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some empty, righteous platitude, but a security guard placed a massive hand squarely on his chest, physically forcing him backward toward the double doors. Vivian stumbled to her feet, her tear-streaked face turning toward me one last time. She looked at me, and then she looked past me, her eyes finding Trey sitting comfortably next to Victoria Sterling, eating a piece of chocolate cake and completely ignoring her existence. The devastation on her face was absolute. She had thrown away a son to save her reputation, and today she had lost both. Iman and Bradley did not fight. They turned and practically ran toward the exit, their heads bowed in utter defeat. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing them out in the cold, severing their connection to my world forever. The string quartet immediately resumed playing the soft, elegant music filling the room once more. The guests slowly returned to their meals, exchanging quiet, approving murmurs about the swift resolution of the disturbance. I turned to look at Marcus. He smiled, a fiercely proud expression illuminating his face. He leaned down and kissed my forehead. I walked over to the table and took my seat next to Trey. He bumped his shoulder against mine, offering me a bite of his cake. I took it, savoring the profound, undeniable taste of absolute victory. "Wait," I commanded, my voice slicing through the elegant ambiance of the banquet hall. The 6 massive security guards froze instantly, their iron grips still firmly attached to the arms and shoulders of my biological family. The heavy oak doors remained propped open, the cool draft from the corridor spilling into the warm room. I did not want them thrown out just yet. Getting physically ejected was a mercy they had not yet fully earned. They needed to be entirely dismantled, stripped of every delusion and lie they had constructed over the past 14 years. They needed to witness the exact magnitude of my victory. If you were watching this unfold through a camera lens, the shot would be a slow, agonizing dolly track, moving horizontally across the lineup of the Washington family, capturing their escalating, suffocating panic. The camera would glide past Bradley, whose aristocratic arrogance had entirely dissolved, leaving behind a sweating, trembling coward who realized he had just insulted a billionaire in his own home. It would move to Iman, her flawless makeup now ruined by nervous sweat, her eyes darting wildly as she finally understood that her entire identity as the successful, perfect daughter was a pathetic illusion. The lens would pass Calvin, the great bishop, whose broad shoulders had caved inward, his pastoral authority crushed under the weight of his exposed hypocrisy. Finally, the camera would lock onto Vivian. She was no longer performing. The theatrical tears had dried, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a woman watching her life burn to ashes. I stood up from the table and stepped toward Trey. He stood up with me, adjusting his silk tie with a calm, practiced elegance that most grown men never achieve. I wrapped my arms securely around his shoulders, pulling him close. He leaned into my embrace, radiating absolute trust and unwavering loyalty. I looked straight into Vivian's horrified eyes. "An orphanage," I repeated, rolling the word around in my mouth as if it were coated in poison. "You stood on a stage in front of Atlanta's most powerful families and wept over an orphanage. You claimed I dumped my flesh and blood into a state facility to rot. Tell me, Vivian, are you referring to Institut La Rosée? Because if you consider a Swiss academy located in a medieval chateau to be an orphanage, your standards have certainly changed." Vivian flinched, her jaw dropping open. For those in the room who are unaware, I announced, projecting my voice clearly to the captivated audience. La Rosée is the most exclusive, fiercely guarded educational institution on the planet. The tuition is $150,000 a year. It is where kings send their heirs. It is where global industry leaders send their children to learn fencing, equestrian sports, and international diplomacy. It is a long way from the underfunded, overcrowded county ward where you left him. I raised my free hand and snapped my fingers twice. Marcus's head of security, who had been standing by the audio-visual controls at the back of the room, immediately hit a switch. The crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly. Behind the head table, a massive high-definition projection screen descended silently from the ceiling. I had not come to this dinner unprepared. When Marcus and I intercepted their communications earlier this week and realized they were planning an ambush, I decided not to merely defend myself. I prepared an execution. The projector flared to life, illuminating the dark ballroom with blinding white light. A document appeared on the screen spanning 20 feet across. It was a court order stamped and signed by a Fulton County judge. "Let us look at the real history of this family." I stated, my tone analytical and merciless. "This is a legal petition for full guardianship. I filed it on the exact morning of my 18th birthday. While Iman was picking out her sorority wardrobe and you were busy expanding the church's real estate portfolio, I was sitting in a cramped legal aid clinic. I had nothing but a high school diploma, 3 minimum wage jobs, and a rage so profound it kept me awake for 3 solid years. I pointed to the bold black ink of the judge's signature. You threw him away because he was born with a congenital heart defect and required specialized physical therapy. A flawed child did not fit the aesthetic of Bishop Washington's Holy Empire. You quietly signed away your parental rights, assuming he would get lost in the system and eventually fade away. But the state found you unfit, and the state found me capable. I fought you, I fought the county, and I won. The image on the screen shifted with a sharp click. A barrage of financial statements flooded the display. Dozens of bank records, wire transfers, and medical invoices appeared, the numbers staggering in their magnitude. There were receipts for pediatric cardiologists, private physical therapists, and elite nutritional specialists. There were wire transfers to European bank accounts, deposits into irrevocable trust funds, and deeds to properties held entirely in Trey's name. While you were standing at your pulpit preaching about charity, Calvin, I was paying for his open heart surgery out of pocket. I continued, my voice ringing like a bell. While you were buying designer handbags to impress your country club friends. Vivian, I was building a logistics company for my dining room table so I could afford to hire the absolute best private tutors in the country. I did not throw him away to chase money. I conquered the corporate world specifically so I could give him the life of a prince. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless sound. She took a trembling step forward, ripping her arm away from the security guard's grip. She looked at the screen, staring at the millions of dollars in medical bills and trust funds. And then she looked at Trey. For the first time, she truly saw him. She saw the perfect posture, the clear, healthy complexion, the custom-tailored suit, and the unmistakable confidence of a young man who knew exactly who he was and exactly how much he was loved. Her narcissistic brain short-circuited. She saw a masterpiece, and she desperately wanted to claim credit for it. My baby, Vivian whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden desperate longing. She reached her hand out toward Trey. My beautiful boy. We did not know. We thought we were doing what was best. If we had known you would turn out like this, we would have never— Do not finish that sentence, I commanded, my voice dropping to a terrifying lethal register. Do not dare insult his intelligence by pretending you care about him now that he is fixed and wealthy. You do not get to claim the victory after abandoning him in the trenches. Trey finally looked at Vivian. There was no anger in his dark eyes. There was no sorrow. There was only a cold, clinical indifference that mirrored Arthur Sterling's exact expression. I do not know you, ma'am, Trey said, his voice smooth, polite, and utterly devastating. I have one mother. She is standing right beside me. You are just the woman who gave birth and walked away. Please do not address me again. The rejection was absolute. It hit Vivian with the force of a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and if the security guard had not grabbed her by the elbows, she would have collapsed onto the hardwood floor. She let out a loud, ugly sob, burying her face in her hands. Calvin was no longer looking at me. He was looking over his shoulder at Deacon Miller and Elder Hayes. The two senior church board members were staring at the massive screen, reading the financial documents and the guardianship papers. Their faces were carved from stone. The men who had followed Calvin here to witness a holy purging were now witnessing the total destruction of their spiritual leader. Deacon Miller pulled his cell phone from his pocket. His eyes locked onto Calvin with deep, furious betrayal. I am calling the executive committee. Calvin the deacon stated, his voice devoid of any respect. You will not be stepping up to the pulpit this Sunday. You will not be stepping into the church building ever again. May God have mercy on your deeply wicked soul. Calvin opened his mouth, raising his hands in a desperate plea, but no words came out. His empire was officially dead. The power, the respect, and the vast wealth he had hoarded through religious manipulation were gone, stripped away in less than 10 minutes. I signaled Marcus's security chief. You can take out the trash now, I said softly. The guards did not hesitate. They gripped the Washington family firmly by their shoulders and marched them backward out of the banquet hall. Iman was weeping openly, her face buried in Bradley's chest, as he frantically tried to shield her from the disgusted stares of the Sterling guests. Calvin stumbled blindly, a broken shell of a man. Vivian was practically dragged through the doorway, her wails echoing down the long marble corridor until the heavy oak doors finally swung shut, sealing them out of my life permanently. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer tense or judgmental. It was the awe-struck, deeply respectful silence of a room full of powerful people who had just watched a queen defend her territory and absolutely decimate her enemies. Arthur Sterling raised his glass of bourbon, holding it high in the air. He looked at me, a genuine, terrifyingly proud smile spreading across his weathered face. To Zuri, Arthur declared, his voice booming with absolute approval. A woman of unparalleled strength, a woman who protects her own. Welcome to the family. The entire room erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, a roaring wave of validation and acceptance. Crystal glasses clinked together. Victoria Sterling stepped forward, pulling me into a warm, fierce embrace, whispering her admiration into my ear. Marcus wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, pressing a kiss to my neck, his entire body vibrating with pride. I stood in the center of the glittering hall, surrounded by immense wealth, profound power, and genuine love. I looked down at Trey, who was smiling brightly, holding his glass of sparkling cider in the air. I had spent 14 years fighting in the dark, building my armor piece by piece, preparing for the day they would try to destroy me. They came for a slaughter, they received a burial, and as I raised my own glass to meet Arthur's toast, I knew that my sweet, relentless revenge was finally complete. The sharp, piercing sound of crystal shattering against the polished hardwood floor broke the heavy silence. The collective attention of the entire room snapped toward the source. Iman stood paralyzed near the back of the hall, her trembling hand frozen in mid-air. A pool of dark red wine spread rapidly across the floor around her designer heels, looking entirely too much like spilled blood. She had not fled with her parents. She was trapped, pinned to the spot by the sheer gravity of her own unfolding nightmare. Marcus moved with the predatory grace that defined the Sterling family. He stepped smoothly onto the small stage, his tailored suit shifting flawlessly with his movements. He leaned down, picked up the silver microphone Vivian had abandoned, and tested it with a single sharp tap. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceilings, demanding absolute, unwavering attention. "My fiancé has been far too generous tonight." Marcus began, his voice a rich, unyielding baritone that commanded the room. "She focuses on the love she has built, rather than the poison she survived. But I do not share her restraint. If we are going to expose the rot within the Washington family, we will pull it out by the roots. And the most important detail has not yet been shared." Marcus paused, his dark eyes locking directly onto Iman's terrified face. "Trey is not Zuri's biological son," Marcus stated. The banquet hall went dead silent. The guests, already reeling from the previous revelations, leaned in, collectively captivated by the absolute destruction of the Washington dynasty. The massive projection screen behind the head table flickered. The financial documents vanished, replaced instantly by high-resolution scans of original medical files. A birth certificate, a clinical DNA profile, a hospital admission form from 14 years ago. The documents were heavily redacted to protect privacy, but the key information was highlighted in a glaring, undeniable yellow. "Let us look at the true anatomy of a hypocrite." Marcus continued, his voice ringing with aristocratic disgust. 14 years ago, the Washington family faced a severe crisis. The bishop and his wife had carefully constructed an image of absolute moral perfection. Their eldest daughter, Iman, was the golden child. She was destined for a prestigious Ivy League education and a flawless, highly marketable future. But the golden child made a catastrophic mistake. She became pregnant by a local street hustler, a man whose very existence would have shattered the bishop's profitable holy facade. Iman let out a strangled gasp, shaking her head frantically. She looked wildly at her husband Bradley, but Bradley was staring at the screen, his face draining of all color as he read the highlighted name on the original hospital admission form. "Calvin and Vivian Washington did not seek the grace they preach from their pulpit," Marcus declared, pointing at the screen. "They sought a scapegoat. They needed a place to dump their shame, and they looked at their younger daughter." Zuri was 15 years old, a child herself. Her parents, the people ordained by God to protect her, forced her into a private, discreet clinic. They forged the paperwork. They used immense psychological and physical intimidation to force a 15-year-old girl to sign her name on a birth certificate as the mother of a child she did not carry. The murmurs in the room grew louder, transforming from shocked whispers into a low, collective growl of genuine outrage. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were ruthless in business, but forcing a child to take the fall for a sibling's pregnancy crossed a universal line of human decency. Once the paperwork was signed, the Washingtons executed the final phase of their cover-up, Marcus said, driving the final nail into their coffin. They packed Zuri's meager belongings into garbage bags. They handed her a sick newborn infant with a severe congenital heart defect, and they threw her out the front door. They exiled their youngest daughter and their biological grandson to the streets. They effectively sentenced them both to poverty and potential death, all to protect their church donations and to ensure Iman could attend her university without a single stain on her record. I remained seated at the head table, my posture perfectly relaxed, my hand resting gently over Trey's. He looked up at the massive screen, analyzing the documents that bore my forged name, and then he looked across the room at Iman. He did not show a shred of sorrow, confusion, or betrayal. He possessed the profound, quiet strength of someone who had been raised in truth, not deception. I had never lied to him about his origins. I waited until he was old enough to understand, and I told him exactly who gave birth to him. He knew exactly who had stayed up for 3 days straight, monitoring his fever after his surgeries. Biology was a footnote. I was his mother, and no projected piece of paper could ever alter the reality of our bond. Iman's face was a mask of sheer terror. The flawless, untouchable pedestal she had stood on her entire life had just been pulverized into dust. She looked at Bradley, her eyes pleading for salvation, begging him to defend her just as he had fiercely defended her honor minutes ago. Bradley stepped away from her. The physical distance he placed between them spoke volumes. He was a man obsessed with legacy pedigree and pristine reputations. He had just learned his entire marriage was built on the darkest, most pathetic lie imaginable. The aristocratic, perfect wife he thought he had married was a complete fabrication. She was a fraud who had allowed her teenage sister to be thrown into the gutter to cover up her own indiscretions. Bradley, Iman whispered, her voice cracking, carrying across the silent room. Please, it was a long time ago. My parents made me do it. Bradley did not answer her. He looked at her with a level of supreme, unadulterated revulsion. He violently brushed at the sleeve of his suit jacket, as if simply standing near her had contaminated him. He turned his back on his wife, his face a mask of absolute humiliation, and walked quickly toward the exit. He did not look back. He pushed through the heavy oak doors and disappeared into the corridor, leaving his marriage and his pride shattered on the ballroom floor. Iman stood completely alone. The protective barrier of her elitist husband was gone. The intimidating shadow of her powerful parents was gone. She was isolated in the center of a room filled with billionaires, politicians, and socialites who were staring at her as if she were a diseased rat. She looked down at the puddle of red wine soaking into the hem of her expensive dress, the physical manifestation of her ruined life. She turned and ran. She stumbled over her own heels, letting out a wretched, humiliated sob as she fled the banquet hall, desperately chasing after a husband who would never look at her the same way again. Marcus calmly placed the microphone back onto its stand. He stepped down from the stage and walked back to the head table, his eyes never leaving mine. The fierce protective fire in his gaze made my heart hammer against my ribs. He took his seat beside me, seamlessly pulling my chair slightly closer to his. The silence lingered for a few seconds more, the air clearing as the final trace of the Washington family's toxicity was flushed from the room. Arthur Sterling broke the quiet. He raised his glass, signaling to the waitstaff. Clear the spilled wine, Arthur ordered smoothly, his voice returning to its normal conversational volume. And bring out the next course. We have a wedding to celebrate, and I refuse to let garbage delay our dinner any further. The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a warm electric current of immense respect. The guests resumed their conversations, their voices slightly louder, slightly more animated, energized by the spectacular display of power they had just witnessed. Victoria Sterling leaned across the table, her eyes shining with genuine affection, and offered Trey a plate of decadent chocolate truffles. I looked around the room, taking in the glittering chandeliers, the exquisite floral arrangements, and the faces of the people who had stood by me when the ghosts of my past tried to drag me back into the dark. I had spent 14 years building my armor, preparing for the inevitable day my family would try to destroy me again. They came expecting an easy slaughter. They expected me to cower. Instead, they walked blindly into an execution, and I had handed them the rope. I squeezed Marcus's hand, a silent thank you for standing shoulder to shoulder with me in the absolute truth. I looked at Trey, watching him laugh at a joke Victoria had just made, completely untouched by the venom of the woman who had given birth to him. The Washington family was gone, permanently erased from our future. The sweet, unrelenting taste of revenge had finally settled, leaving behind nothing but the brilliant, unshakable peace of a life I had fought desperately to build. The massive oak doors of the Sterling banquet hall slammed shut with a concussive boom, completely severing the Washington family from the world of wealth and power they had just tried to manipulate. The sound echoed down the cavernous vaulted ceiling of the grand marble foyer. Outside those doors, there was no elegant string quartet. There was no polite society. There was only the harsh, unforgiving glare of the security lighting and the sudden suffocating realization of total ruin. A violent whip pan would capture the sheer chaos erupting in the corridor. The Sterling security detail immediately stepped back, forming a silent, impenetrable perimeter, crossing their arms and watching the implosion with absolute clinical detachment. They did not need to lay another finger on the trespassers. The Washingtons were about to tear each other apart. The perspective jerked sharply to Iman. She was trembling violently, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. In her shaking hand, she still clutched a crystal glass of red wine she had snatched from a passing waiter during her frantic exit. A tight, extreme close-up would show her knuckles turning white, the manicured nails digging into the fragile glass. Bradley stood 2 feet away from her, completely paralyzed. His chest barely moved. His eyes were wide, fixed on the ornate marble tiles, but he was not seeing the floor. He was replaying the medical records, the DNA results, and Marcus Sterling's booming voice exposing the absolute truth. The Golden Girl, the prestigious, untouchable daughter of the bishop, the woman he had married to elevate his own aristocratic pedigree. She was a fraud. She had slept with a drug dealer, birthed an illegitimate child, and allowed her own parents to throw her 15-year-old sister into the street to cover up her filth. Bradley slowly raised his head. When his eyes locked onto Iman, there was no love. There was no partnership. There was only a supreme, radiating disgust. He looked at her as if she were a rotting corpse. Bradley, Iman whimpered, her voice a pathetic, reedy squeak. "Bradley, please listen to me. It was a mistake. I was young. My parents told me to keep quiet. They said it was the only way I could go to my university. They said it would ruin my life." The camera whips violently as Bradley explodes. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them with a terrifying, explosive energy. He slammed his open palm against the marble pillar directly beside her head. The crack of flesh hitting stone echoed through the foyer like a gunshot. Iman shrieked, her entire body flinching backward. Her trembling fingers lost their grip. The crystal goblet plummeted to the floor. It shattered with a sharp crash, sending a dark, jagged spray of red wine across the pristine white marble and splattering over the hem of her designer dress. It looked like a fresh bleeding wound. "You disgusting, manipulative liar!" Bradley roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings, raw and completely stripped of his usual country club refinement. "You stood there and let me confront Arthur Sterling. You let me lecture a billionaire about morality while you were hiding a bastard child. You let me defend your honor in front of the most powerful family in Atlanta, making me look like an absolute gullible fool." Iman pressed her back flat against the cold pillar, sobbing hysterically. "I wanted to protect our legacy. I did it for us. I knew you would not marry me if you knew the truth." "There is no us!" Bradley snarled, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his rage. "You are not a victim, Iman. You are a predator. You let your teenage sister take the fall for your street trash decisions. You let them throw a sick infant into the system so you could rush the right sorority and pretend to be royalty. You have no pedigree. You have no honor. You are nothing but common trash dressed in expensive silk. You sicken me. No, please, Iman begged, sliding down the pillar, dropping to her knees in the puddle of spilled wine and broken glass. I love you. We have a contract. We have a life. You cannot just leave me here. We have a prenuptial agreement, Bradley corrected his tone, turning to absolute ice. Section 4, Paragraph 2, the strict morality clause. Concealing an illegitimate child, committing severe social fraud, and bringing public shame upon the Reynolds family name is a direct, undeniable violation. You get nothing. I am calling my attorneys the second I get into my car. You will be served with divorce papers by tomorrow morning. Do not return to my house. Do not call my phone. You are completely dead to me. Bradley reached down, grabbed her left hand with ruthless efficiency, and forcefully yanked the massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. Iman screamed as the metal scraped over her knuckle, but Bradley did not care. He dropped the ring into his pocket, turned his back on his weeping wife, and stormed down the corridor. The heavy exit doors swung open, swallowing him into the night. Iman remained on the floor, her hands pressed into the spilled wine, wailing uncontrollably as the illusion of her perfect life dissolved into the marble. A harsh, jarring pan immediately shifts the focus 20 feet to the left. The audio is a cacophony of overlapping, furious voices. Bishop Calvin Washington was backed into a corner, completely surrounded by the 3 senior members of his church board. Deacon Miller, Elder Hayes, and Brother Vance were no longer looking at their spiritual leader with reverence. They were looking at him with a righteous, burning fury. "How dare you!" Deacon Miller bellowed, his deep voice cutting through the sounds of Iman's sobbing. "How dare you stand behind the pulpit of First Trinity for 14 years and preach about the sanctity of family? How dare you look into the eyes of your congregation and demand their tithes, demanding they sacrifice for the church while you were covering up this level of pure, unadulterated evil?" Calvin raised his hands desperately, trying to summon the booming, charismatic voice that had built his empire. "Brothers, please," Calvin stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead, soaking the collar of his custom suit. "You must understand the extreme pressure we were under. The ministry was at a critical turning point. The media would have destroyed the church if Iman's indiscretion came to light. I made a sacrifice to protect the flock. I made a sacrifice for God." Elder Hayes stepped forward, his face twisted in profound disgust. "Do not bring the name of God into your filth," Calvin Hayes spat. "You did not sacrifice for the church. You sacrificed a 15-year-old child. You forced a young girl to sign a fraudulent birth certificate. You threw Zuri out onto the street with a sick infant. You abandoned your own flesh and blood to protect your ego and your bank account. You are a complete fraud." "Zuri was rebellious," Calvin shouted, panic fully taking over his logic. "She needed discipline. We offered to handle the situation quietly, but she refused to obey my authority. She brought this upon herself." "You are a monster, brother," Vance interjected, his voice shaking with anger. "We just watched the evidence on a 20-foot screen. We saw the medical bills. We saw the guardianship papers. Zuri worked herself to the bone to save that boy's life, while you lived in a mansion paid for by the tithes of honest, hardworking people. You are not a shepherd. You are a parasite feeding on the faith of good people." Calvin's chest heaved. He looked at the 3 men, realizing that his spiritual manipulation was completely useless against the hard, undeniable facts. "I am the Bishop of First Trinity," Calvin declared, trying to draw himself up to his full height, attempting to project a power he no longer possessed. "I built that church from the ground up. You cannot speak to me this way. I demand your respect." Deacon Miller let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You built nothing. You stole it through deception, and as of this exact second, your tenure is permanently terminated." Calvin froze, his eyes widening in absolute horror. "You do not have the authority to terminate me without a full congregational vote. It is against the bylaws." "Watch me," Miller growled, stepping directly into Calvin's personal space. "We are invoking the emergency ethics clause of the church charter. You are stripped of all titles, all pastoral duties, and all access to church property. Tomorrow morning, I am calling a full independent forensic audit of every single financial account connected to your name. We are going to track every dollar that moved through that ministry over the last 15 years. If we find out that you used a single cent of church funds to pay off that private clinic or to silence anyone involved in this cover-up, we will not just fire you. We will personally hand the evidence over to the district attorney and watch you go to federal prison. Calvin staggered backward, his shoulders collapsing inward. The color completely drained from his face. The megachurch, the television deals, the private jets, the adoring crowds. Everything he had used to validate his existence had just been ripped from his grasp. He was a king without a kingdom, facing total financial and social ruin. "Hand over your keys," Elder Hayes demanded, extending his open hand. "The keys to the church, the keys to the parsonage, and the keys to the executive vehicle." Now. Calvin's hands shook violently as he reached into his tailored pocket. He pulled out his heavy keychain and dropped it into Hayes's palm. The metal jingled softly, a pathetic sound marking the definitive end of his reign. The camera executes one final rapid pan landing on Vivian Washington. She was standing a few feet away, her back pressed against the cold wall. She had watched her eldest daughter's marriage disintegrate in a matter of seconds. She had watched her husband's entire empire collapse. She was witnessing the total systematic destruction of her reality. Vivian tried to move forward, tried to exert the commanding matriarchal presence that had controlled our family for decades. She could not accept that her influence was gone. "Deacon Miller, please," Vivian said, her voice shaking but still attempting to sound authoritative. "We can manage this quietly. We can step back for a season of prayer and reflection. Do not destroy everything we have built based on Zuri's vindictive lies." Miller stopped and turned his head slowly. He looked at Vivian with an expression of pure contempt. "You are just as guilty as he is, Vivian. You are the architect of this nightmare. Do not ever contact any member of this board again." He turned his back, signaling to the other board members. "We are leaving," Miller said. "I suggest you find a very good defense lawyer, Calvin. You are going to need one." The three men turned and walked away, their strides purposeful and resolute. They bypassed Vivian completely, treating her like an invisible, irrelevant entity. Vivian stood completely alone in the center of the grand foyer. She looked down at Iman, who was still weeping on the floor amidst the broken glass and spilled wine, her perfect dress ruined. She looked at Calvin, who was leaning against the wall, staring blankly at his empty hands stripped of his power. The perfectly curated, wealthy, prestigious life she had guarded with such vicious cruelty was completely gone. There was no mansion waiting for her. There was no status. There was no adoring congregation to validate her superiority. She had traded her youngest daughter and her grandson for power, and now the universe had collected on the debt. Vivian slowly slid down the marble wall, her designer dress crumpling around her. She brought her hands up to her face, a long, agonizing wail tearing from her throat. It was the sound of a woman realizing that she had absolutely nothing left, and that she had absolutely no one to blame but herself. My moment of perfect tranquility was brief. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the banquet hall cracked open just enough for Marcus's chief of security to slip back inside. He navigated the perimeter of the room with silent, urgent strides, arriving at Marcus's side. He leaned down, whispering quietly into my fiancé's ear. Marcus's jaw tightened. He turned to me, his dark eyes flashing with irritation. "Your parents are refusing to leave the estate," Marcus said softly, ensuring our conversation remained private. Bradley drove off and left them. Iman ran down the driveway, chasing his car on foot. Calvin and Vivian are sitting on the front portico. Calvin is claiming he is having a medical emergency and refusing to get into the security vehicle until he speaks to you. I can have the local police drag them away for trespassing right now. I placed my napkin on the table and stood up. "No," I replied, my voice calm and completely steady. "The police will just give them an audience to perform for. I will handle this." Marcus stood up immediately, unwilling to let me face them alone, but I placed a hand firmly on his chest. Stay here with Trey, I instructed. This is the final loose end. I need to sever it myself. I walked the length of the banquet hall, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The security guards pulled the heavy oak doors open for me, and I stepped out into the grand, cavernous foyer. The air was drastically cooler here, stripped of the warmth and celebration of the ballroom. I walked toward the towering glass front doors of the Sterling estate. They opened automatically, revealing the sprawling stone portico and the sweeping, illuminated driveway beyond. The scene before me was a masterpiece of absolute devastation. From my vantage point at the top of the grand marble stairs looking down at the stone courtyard, Calvin and Vivian Washington appeared incredibly small. The sweeping architecture of the Sterling estate dwarfed them, reducing the great megachurch bishop and his aristocratic wife to insignificant specks against the sprawling concrete. They looked utterly pathetic. Calvin was sitting on the bottom step, his head buried in his hands. His custom-tailored suit, normally pressed to sharp perfection, was rumpled and stained with sweat. His pastoral collar was unbuttoned, hanging limply around his neck. Vivian was sprawled on the stone next to him. She had lost one of her designer shoes. Her expensive silk dress was torn at the hem, ruined by the red wine Iman had spilled earlier, and her meticulously styled hair hung in tangled, chaotic strands around her tear-streaked face. They had been abandoned. Their golden daughter Iman had literally run away into the night, desperately chasing a husband who had just discarded her like trash. The church board members had stripped Calvin of his power, his title, and his wealth, leaving him to face the crushing reality of a forensic audit alone. I stood at the top of the stairs, the warm light from the foyer spilling out behind me, casting my shadow long and dark over their trembling bodies. I did not say a word. I simply looked down at them, letting the sheer crushing weight of my presence press them further into the stone. Calvin lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep dark circles of profound panic. When he saw me standing above him, something inside his mind completely snapped. The last shred of his inflated ego vanished. The great Bishop Washington scrambled forward on his hands and knees. He dragged his heavy body up the first 2 marble steps, his expensive trousers scraping harshly against the stone. He did not stand up. He stayed on his knees, bowing his head, pressing his hands together in a desperate, frantic gesture of submission. Zuri Calvin gasped, his voice a hoarse, ragged wheeze. "Zuri, please. You have to stop this. You have to stop them." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I felt the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. "Stop who, Calvin?" I asked, my voice cutting through the crisp night air like a blade. "The board." Calvin pleaded, tears openly streaming down his face, dripping off his chin onto the marble. "Deacon Miller is calling the district attorney tomorrow. They are going to audit the church accounts. They are going to look for the money I used to pay off the clinic when Iman got pregnant. If they find it, I will go to federal prison. They will take the house. They will take my pension. I will have nothing left." He crawled up one more step, reaching his trembling hand out toward the hem of my dress, though he did not dare touch me. "You have to tell them you forged those medical records," Calvin begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "You have to tell the press it was a lie. You have all this money now, Zuri. You have the Sterling family. You have everything you ever wanted. You do not need to ruin me. I will lose my entire life." I stared down at him. "You are asking me to commit perjury to save the man who forced me to forge a birth certificate when I was 15 years old," I stated, summarizing his request with brutal clarity. "You are asking me to lie to the federal government to protect a man who threw me and a sick newborn child into the street." "Zuri, we are blood!" Calvin cried out, slamming his fist against his own chest. He was deploying his final, most desperate weapon. He was trying to use the biological tie he had completely ignored for 14 years. "You cannot do this. You cannot destroy your own family. I am your father. Vivian is your mother. We gave you life. We are flesh and blood. You are a Christian woman. You must understand grace. You must understand forgiveness. You cannot annihilate your own family over a mistake we made in the past." Vivian dragged herself up the stairs behind him. She was crawling, her bare foot scraping against the stone. She grabbed Calvin's shoulder, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. "We were trying to protect your sister." Vivian sobbed, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek. Iman was so fragile. She had a scholarship. She had a future. If the church found out she was pregnant by a drug dealer, it would have ruined her. It would have ruined all of us. You were young, Zuri. You were strong. We knew you could survive it. We knew you could handle it. We did not mean to hurt you. We just needed you to carry the weight for a little while. Please, my baby, please have mercy on us." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. She was actually trying to frame her abuse as a compliment to my strength. She was trying to justify sacrificing one daughter to save the other. I took one slow, deliberate step down the marble staircase. Calvin and Vivian both flinched backward, shrinking away from my proximity. "You do not get to use the word family with me," I said, my voice eerily quiet, but echoing loudly in the stillness of the estate grounds. Family is not defined by shared DNA. Family is defined by sacrifice, protection, and unconditional loyalty. My family is inside that ballroom right now. My family is a 14-year-old boy who knows exactly who held him when his chest was cut open for heart surgery. You are not my family, Calvin. You are simply a biological technicality. You are a genetic accident that I survived. I took another step down. "Do you remember the night you kicked me out?" I asked, forcing them to look directly into my eyes. "Do you remember the exact words you said to me when I stood by the front door holding a baby that was turning blue because his heart was failing?" Calvin shook his head frantically, terrified of the memory. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears as if she could block out the sound of my voice. "I remember," I continued, mercilessly dragging them back to that night. "I begged you for a coat. It was November. It was freezing rain. I asked you for $50 to buy formula. And you looked at me, Calvin, standing in your warm, expensive foyer, and you said, 'You are dead to this household. If you come back, I will have you arrested for trespassing.' You looked at a 15-year-old girl holding an infant with a congenital heart defect, and you threw her into the freezing rain to protect your precious public image." Calvin let out a loud, agonizing groan, burying his face in the marble steps. He was completely broken, crushed by the inescapable reality of his own monstrous actions. "And now you kneel on my property," I said, my tone dripping with absolute disdain. "You crawl on the stones of my estate begging for mercy. You ask me to save you from the very church board you manipulated for decades. You want me to stop the forensic audit. You want me to lie to the press." I stopped on the step directly above them. "I am not going to call the press, Calvin," I stated. Calvin's head snapped up. A tiny, pathetic glimmer of hope sparked in his bloodshot eyes. He thought his groveling had worked. He thought the blood manipulation had actually hit its mark. Vivian let out a breathless gasp, her hands reaching out toward me again. "I am not going to call the press," I repeated, looking down at his desperate, tear-stained face. "Because I do not have to. Deacon Miller already has the original copies of the medical records. Elder Hayes already has the bank statements showing the exact amount of money you wired to that private clinic to buy their silence. They took the files with them when they walked out of here. Your board of directors is going to destroy you, Calvin. The district attorney is going to seize your assets. The IRS is going to audit every single charity gala you ever hosted. I do not need to lift a finger to ruin your life. You built the guillotine yourself." I simply handed them the rope. The glimmer of hope in Calvin's eyes died instantly, replaced by a hollow, endless void of absolute despair. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold stone, his body shaking with silent, hyperventilating sobs. Vivian collapsed next to him, curling into a tight ball, weeping into the ruined fabric of her dress. They were entirely defeated. There was no escape. There was no redemption. Their grand religious empire had been reduced to a puddle of tears on my driveway. I turned my back on them. I walked slowly up the grand marble staircase, my posture immaculate, my spirit completely unburdened. I did not look back. I reached the top of the stairs, the heavy glass doors sliding open to welcome me back into the warmth and light of the Sterling estate. I stepped inside, leaving the architects of my childhood nightmares crying in the dark exactly where they belonged. The heavy glass doors had almost slid shut when a feral, desperate scream shattered the quiet of the estate grounds. Blood. Calvin wailed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, animalistic panic. Zuri, we are your blood. You cannot completely destroy your own family. I stopped. The automated doors sensed my presence and silently glided back open. I turned around slowly, stepping right to the very edge of the grand foyer. From where Calvin and Vivian were kneeling on the cold driveway, looking up the towering flight of marble stairs, I was framed by the brilliant golden light of the Sterling mansion. I stood above them, an immovable force of absolute sovereign power. Blood, I repeated, rolling the word around my tongue, as if tasting poison. You talked to me about blood. My voice was devoid of any emotion. It was ice. It was finality. Family is not the people who throw a 15-year-old girl and a sick, struggling newborn out onto the street in the dead of winter. I stated each word dropping onto them like a physical blow. Family is not a biological accident that demands loyalty while offering nothing but abuse and betrayal. I felt a warm, solid presence step up beside me. Marcus and Trey had walked out from the banquet hall, standing firmly at my shoulders. They formed an impenetrable wall of support. I reached out, weaving my fingers through Marcus's hand on my left and grasping Trey's hand on my right. My family is right here, I declared, looking down at the broken figures of my past, and my family protects its own. At that exact fraction of a second, a sound erupted from inside the mansion. It started as a single sharp ping, then a buzz, then a chime. Within 5 seconds, it swelled into a massive overlapping chorus of alerts. Every single cell phone belonging to the hundreds of elite guests inside the ballroom, the security personnel lining the walls, and the valet staff waiting in the driveway began ringing and vibrating in perfect orchestrated unison. Marcus squeezed my hand, a dark, profoundly satisfied smile spreading across his face. Calvin's own phone, buried deep in his ruined suit jacket, vibrated violently against his chest. His trembling, sweaty fingers fumbled to retrieve it. As he stared at the glowing screen, the last remaining trace of color completely drained from his face. His jaw unhinged in sheer silent terror. Marcus's public relations firm, I explained smoothly, watching Calvin's entire universe implode. They just hit the send button. We did not merely hand the documents to the church board. That would have been too quiet, too contained. We had taken the unredacted DNA results, the forged birth certificate, the extensive financial trails of hush money, and the verified medical records, and we delivered them directly to the most powerful news desks in the country. The story was already headlining the digital front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every major broadcast network in America. The holy megachurch fraud, I said, making sure my voice carried over the relentless buzzing of digital notifications. The bishop's dirty secret. The Golden Daughter's teenage cover-up. It is all live, Calvin. Millions of people are reading about your hypocrisy right now. Vivian let out a guttural, suffocating shriek. She dropped her phone onto the hard marble stairs, the screen shattering into dozens of pieces. The tiny, desperate sliver of hope they had clung to, the delusion that they could somehow manage this, quietly spin the narrative, and survive the scandal, was completely and permanently sealed shut. There is nowhere left to hide, I promised them, offering no mercy. You are going to watch your empire burn in the daylight. I took a step back, pulling my true family with me. The heavy glass doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of their weeping and sealing them outside in the freezing dark forever. As I turned on my heel and walked back into the warmth of the foyer, the view behind me framed the perfect, pathetic ruins of the people who had tried to bury me. Every step I took forward left them further behind, their desperate sobbing muffled and ultimately silenced by the thick glass. The fallout was swift and absolute. By Monday morning, Bradley had officially filed for divorce, ruthlessly enforcing the strict morality clause in their prenuptial agreement. Iman was left entirely empty-handed, her credit cards frozen, her flawless reputation shredded. The prestigious sorority alumni network she had worshipped publicly revoked her membership, erasing her from their social registers as if she had never existed. Calvin did not just lose his pulpit. The forensic audit initiated by Deacon Miller triggered a massive federal investigation into tax evasion and wire fraud. The magnificent Washington estate was seized by the IRS, leaving my biological parents completely destitute, drowning in a public scandal they could never pray their way out of. 6 months later, a wedding did take place. It was not held in Calvin's suffocating hypocritical sanctuary. It was held on the sprawling sunlit lawns of my own private estate. The air smelled of white roses and fresh beginnings. I stood on the grand marble balcony overlooking the lush gardens dressed in a breathtaking custom silk gown that trailed elegantly behind me. Marcus stood to my right, his hand resting securely on my waist, his dark eyes filled with absolute adoration. Trey stood to my left, handsome and perfectly poised, holding the velvet box containing our wedding bands. I looked out at the horizon, feeling the warm breeze against my face, and then I looked directly forward. I smiled a radiant, profoundly victorious smile. The sweetest revenge is not destroying them, I said, the absolute truth ringing in my voice. The sweetest revenge is letting them stand in the mud looking up at you, building a kingdom they will never, ever have the right to enter. The world around me faded into a deep, peaceful black.